Hey everyone, this is Rashmi from Designhill and your host for the day. First of all, I hope you guys are staying safe and doing well. I would like to welcome you to this workshop wherein we are going to talk about how to do bounce lettering with Kerry Pearson. The event is brought to you by Designhill, which is the world's leading creative marketplace that caters to the creative needs of businesses and individuals alike who can source high quality designs and buy unique products created by independent artists by using its print on demand marketplace called Print Shop by Design Hill. Moving ahead, let me introduce our guest for today's workshop. We have Kerry Pearson. She is best known for lettering and watercolor painting and have been lettering for 3 years now. She's a self-taught artist and have been running a group with her friends wherein she's teaching others for 2 years with the aim to give people access to free resources which were not available when they started out. Kerry, please say a quick hi to the audience and introduce yourself and let them know more about yourself.
Been covered pretty well, but yeah, I've been hand lettering for a couple of years now. I started when I got into bullet journaling. I have also done an illustration degree, but I don't really use that very much anymore. I actually work full-time in healthcare now. So yeah, I just picked it up as a hobby to make my bullet journal a bit prettier, and then got into it with my friend to teach others how to letter better. So yeah, that's pretty much how I got started, and now I also dabble in watercolour, do watercolour lettering and stuff as well.
All right, guys. So before we start, let's quickly look at what Print Shop by Designhill is all about, and then we'll jump back right into the session. Okay, now let's get started with the session. Kerry, over to you now.
Going over the basic tools that you're going to need. If you guys have been doing brush lettering for a while, then you'll already be probably acquainted with these pens, but they are brush pens. I've got quite a few here. I wanted to start with brush lettering in general because a good foundation with brush lettering will make it a lot easier for you to do bounce lettering. So I've got a selection here. I just wanted to quickly show you in case you hadn't seen these ones before. I've got 2 zebra pens and a Faber-Castell, and then I've got Marby pens as well. I've got the Tombow Jaw. Sorry. I've got the Tombow Jaw pen, the Tombow Food pen, Pentel, and these all have different brushes on them. So if you are a beginner, you're going to want to start out with a small brush pen, and these are stuff like your Tombow Food pen or your Pentel. Your Marby colouring is a good beginner pen, but also good for experienced letterers as well. This pen is really quite flexible, so it is a little bit harder as a beginner to get used to it, but it's still a good pen. Then you've got the 2 zebra pens as well. These are quite small pens. This one is a little bit more flexible. the medium one. And then you've got your Faber-Castell, which is a good beginner pen as well. Got quite a small brush. You see the Tombow pen all the time on Instagram. If you are a beginner, it is not a good pen to start with. The brush tip, as you can see, is quite large and it is really flexible as well. If I compare that to the food pen, you can see the differences in the pen tip. You're also going to need really good quality paper, otherwise you're going to ruin these brush pens. I'm using Moda paper here, but you can also use Canson, marker paper, or HB Premium paper. It just needs to be smooth, otherwise you're going to fray brush pens. And I made this mistake when I started lettering, and I ruined a lot, and I mean a lot, of brush pens. So I did this workbook. You guys can see. Let me just adjust that. Did this workbook, which is linked in the chat, which you can download for free. And this is a guide to brush lettering and mainly bounce lettering as well, which is what I'm going to talk about mainly today. So in this, I've included basic strokes for you. And these are the strokes that make up all your letters. I've got 2 bouncing guides here, which I'll come back to in a minute. And then I've got a lowercase and an uppercase for you guys. I think what is important to mention quickly is that style plays a huge role in brush lettering, and my style might not be your style. I don't include a lot of loops and stuff into my work because I like a more casual feel to it, but the principles are going to be exactly the same. So, and also another thing you're going to want is a pencil. I use a pencil all the time when I'm doing bigger pieces, anything other than one word. I'll use a pencil to sketch it out as well. So if I start with the brush strokes, you'll all probably be very familiar with these. These workshop sheets are also designed to be used with a small pen as well. So I'm going to be using a Pentel. It's my favourite pen throughout this workshop. So I'm not going to go through everything because you probably already know sort of what you're doing if you want to learn how to bounce. But we've got the thick and thin lines here, and then you've got your under and overturns, and there is a diagram on the left hand side with arrows here showing you how to form the stroke. An example without, so you can see it clearly, and then practice ones which you can trace, and then you've got space here as well to do it on your own. For bouncing, you're going to want to focus on your pressures in the undertones, because these are the ones you're going to use most often to create bounce in your letters. And a little tip, if you are struggling with the change in pressures, try to make your turns a little bit wider. It will give you a nice smoother curve if you're doing that as well. The worksheets that I've done for the lowercase, I'll bring it down a little bit so you can see the A. These are sort of already bounced. They're not all sitting on the baseline, and I'm going to go over the different lines in a minute with you. So I've designed these so they've already got an aspect of bounce in them, so it's a little bit easier for you to get into it properly. And I've also done the same with the uppercase here. So I'm going to go through each individual letter and different ways that you can bounce them. And
Kerry, sorry
yeah,
to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt in between. In the chat, I see people are saying that the screen is not very clear. So I think let's wait few seconds to for the camera to get the focus on the sheets so that it is visible to everyone.
okay.
So you can also read the chat in the chat section to see what people are saying so that you can answer the questions accordingly and we can interact with them as well. So the chat would be in front of you on your screen.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've got it. Okay, so screen looks clear in the chat. So the worksheets, they were in the chat at the start of this worksheet, so you can download it. But if you are struggling to find it or anything, you can just message me on Instagram or email me as well at the Inky Brush or hello@theinkybrush.com, and I can get a link over to you where you can download it. Yeah, I was saying that if you take the A, for example, it bounces a little bit because of the second stroke, which dips under the baseline. So if I'm going to explain bouncing, I'm going to grab the sheet I've got underneath here, where I've got lines, and if I grab a pen, at school, when you're learning to write, you would have been shown about these 3 lines here. And this is the lines we use to create our normal letters when we're writing. So here, you've got your cap height, you've got your X height or your waist, and you've got your baseline. So this is where all your letters touch that have ascending stems to them. So you're thinking your B or your D or your L, K, etc. The baseline here is where all your letters normally sit, so it's nice and straight. And the waist here is where your letters such as E, O, the ovals on your B and D, they usually meet at the top here. When we're doing bounce lettering, we've also included 2 other lines, and this is the ascender line right at the top, which is this one, and then the one at the bottom, which is your descender line as well. So I don't use the ascender line very much. I think sometimes it can make your ascending lines a little bit too long, but it's there if you do want it. It's especially useful if you're doing loops on your like D and B and stuff. Gives you a little bit more room to make them loops. So I'm just going to show you what a normal letter would look like. So I recommend when you're starting to get a feel for bounce lettering to maybe use a pencil. And if you are used to bounce lettering or brush lettering already, then a brush pen's fine. I do recommend starting with a small brush pen, as I said, either a Pentel or a Tombow Food, anything that has a small tip to it that looks a little bit like that. You want to have more control than you would for the Tombow Jaw pen, for example. So if you're going to do a normal A, I'll actually dip that one a bit. I'll do that again. It will look something like that. It sits on the baseline and it meets at the waist here. If you're going to bounce it, then you could bounce it by dipping underneath. There's a really cool tip as well if you want to create instant bounce to your work, whereas vowels and stuff you can make smaller. So for an E or an A, I or an O or whatever, You can just make them smaller, make them hit at the waist height here, or your X height, but bring them off the baseline. It's not often that I'll say bring something up off the baseline, works well, but in the case of vowels, it does actually work quite well. So you just make it smaller, and there's instant bounce to it. I'm going to go through them all individually, but I am going to go into a pad rather than on lines. I do find lines are good when you want to learn what you're doing, but they can be really distracting as well. So if I move them out the way, I'll just grab my paper. I'll start with the letter A. Hopefully you all guys can see it. I'm using the Pentel at the moment. So I'll draw in some lines a little bit so you can see. So for A, there's not many ways you can bounce the letter A, but bringing it underneath the baseline, but the rest touch here, or you can make it smaller. And the way you can do it to create a bit of movement, bring it the second line up and over the X height, but keep the oval sort of in the same position. If you're struggling with the ovals as well, there's another tip. You can start it on the inside instead of at the top like I was just doing. You start it here, bring it round and up. It's a lot easier to get a flush line, but I wouldn't worry too much about that if you're doing stuff like B or D, because your stem is going to hide that. You can also do, if we move on to B, we can do it where this is your baseline here. We can bring this underneath and round. You could also hit the baseline, but bring this inwards here. But with this loop, you can create bounce by coming off it instead of up. You can go sort of downwards a little bit depending on what letter you're going into. You can also add loops. So if I add the top line here, you can bring your loop up and over that by height. I normally stick with out loops, it's just my personal style. You can also make these loops if you want movement but not necessarily bounce. You can bring them right out as well. But one tip, if you are using loops, you're going to want to make sure all your loops are the same throughout your word. So if you're going to do a G or a Y or anything, you're going to want them to be the same sort of size as the one at the top, just to create some balance. If we move on to C, C isn't a letter that bounces very well at all. You have your normal C. But what you can do is move it off the baseline, but hit at the same point and make it smaller, and that will create a little bit of bounce. If you've got a word that hasn't got letters that bounce very well, it's a quick tip to make it bouncy. D is very much the same as a B, except for you don't have this nice loop where you can bring it under. Instead, I would treat it sort of like an A, where you would bring it round, and with the stem, you'd bring that down instead. Example with the word with the letter B. Okay, so if you're going to write, say, baby, that's where I can come to. And it's got 2. Then dip it under, round, and this Y is about the same there. Yep, I will get round to the letter S. I'm just going to go through it in order. And then you can also do the letter D with the oval smaller, like you would if you wanted to make an A or C bounce and bring that off, but then you're not going to want to dip the stem too far because it's going to look not like the letter D. And what's important is readability. So I do see a lot of people make mistakes where they're just using the letters that they normally would. So if you say formed your letter like this, what they'll do is just keep it the same, but move the letter sort of up and down. And if that's your personal style, that's fine. It's not really bounce lettering. What you want to do with all your letters is try and sort of create some asymmetry with them instead. So not everything's not nice and neat into like a little box. E is the same as C. It doesn't really bounce very well, but you can also move it up off the baseline, but hit at the top. So it will give your word an overall sense of bounce instead. F, there are so many different Fs out there that you can do. The most simple one is probably just down and hit there. For this, you're going to want to change the style of the loop depending on what the rest of your word is. I find F is one that when it's in a word, you're not going to want to bounce it too much because it distracts a lot from the rest of the word and it becomes quite unreadable. You can also do a more, I apologise, a more normal type of F, which I do like to do. This is just like that, but you can create bounce with it by using this line, your crossbar, and bringing it up. It creates a sense of movement, especially if it's not just a straight line. I'll let it settle a little bit. Hopefully it will come in focus for you guys. Okay. G is quite a fun one, and a normal G, you're just going to do it sort of like that. Bring that line across here. You can do what I said with the vowels with the G as well if you want to make it a bit smaller. You can bring up the second up top to create a bit of set movement here, and with the descender you can really play around with that. You can make it big, you can flourish it if you want, but again, if you've got ascending loops as well, then you're going to want to keep them sort of the same. Is everyone still there? Okay, that's fine. Be the H. H, you're going to want to keep your stem as the first stroke as normal, but then you've got your second stroke which you can play with, and what I normally do is I bring it down past baseline. So you've got this dip here. Some people do like to bring it up like that. I do use this star sometimes. It depends on the word and what kind of feel I'm going for. And again, with the ascending loops, you can have a play with that. Bring it right up. Or you bring it outwards around 2. I is the one letter I do actually hate seeing bounced. For me, it's not very aesthetically pleasing, and it does sort of make the word quite hard to read. It's the same with the letter A. These two letters, because it is just a thick downstroke most of the time, you just got the little tail normally. It sort of cuts your word in half. So you don't want to be making it even more obvious by bouncing it up and down, because it's going to be really distracting in the word overall. So what I like to do with an I is just to keep it nice and small. I also tend to write more on this angle than downwards. I feel it gives it a bit nicer flow. It doesn't cut the word in half. It makes it a lot more readable as well. So if you do have a word where you've got I's in it quite a lot, I would recommend just making it smaller, bringing it up off the baseline, but keep it hitting the X height or your waist of your word. J is next. J is another one that can be a little bit tricky to bounce. Can you repeat the G? Yes, I can. I'll let that focus for a second. Okay. So with the G here, this was the normal G. You can bring it up off the baseline, sort of still hit the waist, make that overall smaller. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to get a lot in here. I'll try and go a little bit slower for you guys. The second one, I brought this stem right up over the X height, kept the oval a little bit smaller, but still hitting that baseline. And the stem on the next two, the descending stem, I made a really big one. And then you can also add movement with flourishing if you're confident with flourishing. It is definitely a skill that's hard to learn, and it does take a lot of practice. This one could also just sort of come up here to connect to the next letter, or if you want to end a little bit more flourishy there. Let me turn the page again. So J, you're basically just taking that descending stem off your Y or your G, and you're trying to make it sort of have some kind of movement in it. So if I draw a baseline here, X height, normally I would stay sort of at X height for J. You can bring it up right to the baseline, or you could bring it out here to create a bit of movement. You could also add a little entrance stroke, bring it down, and with this stem here, your first or your second stroke, depending on if you're including the entrance line, instead of just going sort of down at an angle quite straight and round, you can add an almost S shape to it, where you start towards the top right, come in a bit and come out. This is quite an exaggerated example, just so you guys can see it a little bit better, but I did that here in this S, where I just came over a bit and then curved myself under. It can add movement to descending letters that otherwise won't bounce so much. And with a J, I always do add a little dot, because otherwise it can end up being quite unreadable. K is a letter I really hate lettering, and it's the start of my name, which just makes it even worse. I tend to go with a standard letter K in a letter, so like a capital. And with this one, you can bring your first stroke quite high, which gives it a bit of a bounce upwards. Or you could bring the last stroke down. You can also keep this letter quite wide to give yourself even more movement to your letters. If you don't want to do a K like that, you do have the option of the ones with the loop. Again, for this one, I'll keep this first stroke quite high, because otherwise it'll end up looking a bit like a capital R. I'll keep this hitting the baseline, but with this, the last stroke, I'll dip that under a little bit. You could also add it with a loop if you really wanted some height. And for these ones, this is where the ascender line really comes into play, rather than if I was just going for a stem without a loop. Here, it gives you more space to add that loop in, because otherwise you're going to be starting right here at the bottom, and you're not going to have much room for the second part of your letter. You could make this loop smaller if you wanted. But okay, the best place to bounce it is with this stroke here, to dip it underneath the baseline. So like here is the baseline. Here, that one just dips down just a little bit underneath. L is a letter that you're going to see probably in a lot of words where you have double L's. And I'll go through what to do with double letters in a moment. My L, it tends to be just a straight up and down, but my baseline is here. So I'll dip it all under the baseline. You can keep it on the baseline, but bring this upwards. If you keep going and dipping underneath the baseline in your word too much, you can add your loop, hit the baseline, or you could do both. Bring it up and underneath. Yeah, I'll be writing words at the end after I finish the alphabet, and I'll take your guys' words that you want to see bounced, so you can see live examples of them. Yeah, I'll do that for you.
All right, guys. I'm sure you all are enjoying this discussion and this workshop. I can read some lovely comments in the chat. So before we move forward, I would quickly like to give a quick shout out to Print Shop by Designhill for organizing this workshop. Stay tuned with us, and we'll be right back to hear from Perry.
I've always been creative and always been an artist. As a young girl, I used to paint rocks and I used to sell them for a quarter on the street. And I just fell in love with it. It just grew into a passion of mine. I started looking on the web and I came across Designhill, and they had a design contest to design a logo, and I entered it and I won. And I was like, oh, this is really great. I can pick and choose what type of logos or design projects I want to work on. And it allows me to be creative, keep my hands, with my tools and working. So it's kind of nice. It's really easy to use. You can scroll through the projects and there's sections that you could go by. It's really easy. There's a few clients who have come back to use the one-on-one projects. There's one client in particular, she owns a vintage shop, and I designed her logo, and she came back. She needed a design for a flyer, and she really liked the illustrations that I did for her, so she came back a couple of times with projects. I would recommend it, especially if you're a designer that's starting out and you want to learn from other designers, seasoned designers. It's a place to keep in the game and keep using your tools. It makes me feel great, and it kind of confirms that I should be doing this. And I love to see logos that I've designed out, and proud of that. And I think that the clients are so happy that their logo represents what they do and makes them look good. It's a collaboration. It's good for me, and it's definitely good for them.
All right, that was a quick shout out to Print Shop by Designhill. And Kerry, I would like to request you to sort of let's take few questions. I see a lot of questions in the questions tab, and then we'll jump back right to the right into the session. So I'll take those questions which has got like maximum upvotes first, and then we'll move forward with the discussion. So this one question, which is there in the question tab, it says it has got 10 upvotes, and the question is, what are the mistakes that beginners are making when doing bounce lettering? So if you can, throw some light on the top mistakes that people make when they're starting into bounce lettering.
Worksheets that actually might be a little bit helpful here. You can see. So here is a mistake that I see a lot of people doing. And in this bit, it is where you keep your letter forms as you've learned to write them in school. So you don't move them at all in their actual form. And all people do is sort of move them up and down. And it ends up being a little bit all over the place. It doesn't read very well as a word, and it doesn't look very pleasing. So instead of changing the position on the paper, you need to make your letters a little bit more asymmetrical. So as I showed with the A, I've got an example in here as well. Instead of doing that, adding the bottom stem here makes it a little bit more asymmetrical, and same here as well. Got examples with a few of my favourite letters to bounce on in the worksheet, so it'll give you some examples of that and where people go wrong. And the other mistake that I see most often is when people exaggerate the bounce a little bit too much. So even if they are changing the way the letter is formed itself, I see them still moving it up and down like far too much, and it ends up having a letter somewhat up here and one down here. So it's really hard to read. But in lettering, it's really important that it's still readable, because we want to communicate what we are actually lettering. It's not just about the composition, it's about the message that we are putting across as well.
Okay, and the next question I see over there is, do you have any specific tips for those who are lefties, like those who are using their left hand to draw or to write? Like any specific tips for them? Yeah.
So I'm not left-handed, and there are a lot of challenges with left hands. I find with left-handed, because you have to sort of pull your hand across rather than with ours, it just it flows nicer. on the right hand side, you need to be looking at the way you hold your pen. So I hold my pen at this sort of angle. With the left hand, you're going to need to find a more comfortable place than trying to just mirror a right-handed hold on your pen. Normally when I see good left-hand letterers, they normally have a little bit more of an upright grip on their pen, and the way they hold their pencil, pen with the paper, is they sort of go over rather than under when they're doing their letters. So they're pushing down at the same sort of angle that you do for a right-left hand letterer, instead of trying to come this way into your wrist. They're still making the same motion, because when you're lettering, you're not lettering with just your fingers. You need to be using your wrist up to your arm sometimes, depending on how big you're making your letters. So yeah, try a more of an over angle rather than trying to come to your wrist. You might find it a little bit easier to form them letters.
Okay, and there are a few more questions with respect to holding the pens and the kind of pens that you're using. So since we are talking about how to hold the pen, so is there any any other tips that you would like to share in terms of how to hold the pen to write this kind of bounce lettering style?
Yeah, so I find the way you hold your pen is really personal to the person. I tend to hold mine still quite close to the tip. I struggle to hold it up here. If I get a Tombow pen, it might be a bit easier for you to see what I mean. A lot of people recommend to beginners, and if you Google how you should hold them, they'll say you hold them so your fingers are sort of in the middle of the pen instead of how you normally hold a pen. It's really personal. It's what feels comfortable to you. If you are struggling and you're holding it right here, it does give you less range. So try moving your grip up a little bit, and at the paper, make sure it's not directly down, not too horizontally either. You're looking for a 45-degree angle between your pen and your paper, but it is really personal. If you don't feel comfortable to you, you're not going to get a nice smooth line. So you're looking for comfort as well as that angle, really.
Okay, and Kerry, which all pens are you using, and what pens would you recommend for beginners to start with?
Okay, so the pens I have here, the ones that I'd recommend for beginners are going to be your Tombow food pen. This has got a really small tip and it comes in hard and soft. I prefer the soft Tombow food pen, but normally a hard pen is a lot easier to begin with. The tip isn't as flexible with a hard, and that makes it easier to get them. Gives you more control to get them variants in pressure. Pentel Sign Touch pens. This is the one that I reach to most of the time. It's another small brush pen. It's not very flexible, so again, it gives you a lot of control over your letters. There are also two zebra pens. This is the extra fine, and this is the medium one. This one is quite bold. It's a lot more flexible as well than this one is. This one's really quite stiff, so you're not going to get very smooth transitions when you start with this one, but it is really good for learning the pressure that you need to put down on them. And the last pen that I'd probably recommend for beginners is the Faber-Castell. It's really flexible if you compare it to the other pens I've just mentioned, so you can get a really exaggerated difference between your thick and thin lines with this one, and it will also help you transition more to something like a Tombow jaw pen, which I wouldn't recommend for a beginner to use. I did start with a Tombow gel pen when I first started out lettering, and I gave up for about 5 months before I even picked up a brush pen again. It's really hard to learn with such a big and flexible brush tip. And the other one, actually, I'll mention quickly, is the Marby colouring pens. It's another small tip, but these are really, really flexible pens. So again, this will help you transition to a larger brush pen. And they're probably the favourites and the only pens I really use. I have got about 200 different brush pens, but I'll probably recommend these ones first over anything else that I have got.
All right, and a lot of people are asking for workbook as well. So would it be possible for you to share the link of the workbook at the end of the session?
Yeah, of course I will.
All right, guys. So I hope, guys, all the major questions has been answered here. If you have any more questions, feel free to put them in the questions tab. We have limited time, and we'll try to answer the remaining questions as well. For now, let's get back to the workshop.
Okay. So I'm going to quickly try and get through the rest of the alphabet with you guys before the end. So I'm just going to go through M and N together. So with this one, you have your 3 different strokes. You have your stem, your first overturn and your second overturn. These 2 overturns are what you can bounce with. I personally always bounce my first overturn, second stroke, bring it up, and I'll dip it down just slightly below the baseline, but I also don't hit the baseline on my first downward stroke. And then I use that one the same. So I've bounced up and down on this M, and then I also can do the same on the second overturn. Instead, it bounce up and then down. So it depends on your style, which one you prefer. And if you just take out one of these overturns, then you've got your N. So you can bounce up and down. You can bounce just up and bring it above your baseline here. Or you can just bounce it underneath as well, underneath that baseline here. Them 2 are my favourite letters to bounce. You can have quite a lot of fun with these ones and exaggerate these ones a little bit more than you can most letters. Then the O is another oval. It doesn't really bounce very well, so I always make the habit of trying to make it a little bit smaller if I draw in these lines here. So I'm hitting the waist at the top, well, it's the middle, but bringing it up. You could also add in ovals, so you don't hit the waist with your first sort of stem. It is all one stroke, but you bring it up to the baseline there. But having the difference here really creates some movement. Is it stopped? You see the video? Okay. And then the P is sort of like I've actually run out of room here. The P is the same as a letter B, really. You can do the same thing, but you're just going to do it underneath the baseline instead of over the top. So you bring it down as you normally would, and then with this you can just bring it below the baseline here. That's if it's very exaggerated. It's a bit shaky. You can do it less exaggerated. Still bringing that curve at the bottom underneath the baseline. You could then move this stem up as well to create a bit more bounce. You can add a little flourish here. With an S, I tend to do a normal S, which is just sort of like this, the normal S. but with the weight difference. It doesn't bounce very well. You can bring this bit here underneath your baseline. I'll normally try and keep this at just over the X height, your waist here, and that's how normally letters are formed. And then if you want to do a more traditional S, you can bring that up, you can dip this underneath your baseline and round, or you can bring this line up over your waist and down as well. S tends to look a little bit better small unless you're doing a capital at the start of your letter. So I'll try and keep that the sort of same height as between your baseline and X height. And then if we're moving on to T, I'm conscious of time here. You can dip it below like you do your L. And then you can add movement, bring it up with the crossbar. You could also add the stem a little higher as well if you've got a word that hasn't got many ascenders in them. And keep that at base height. U, I'm going to move on to quickly. It's going to be similar to the letter A, just going to be an open letter A where you bring it underneath and you can keep it underneath the baseline. You can do it smaller. This is very small. What I like to do with the U is to bring your second stroke up as well. So you've got this asymmetry here. When you're moving on to a letter like V, V doesn't bounce very well at all. It's quite rigid in its form. So I try to make it a little bit curved when I do my lines. Instead of doing a straight line, I'll curve it and I'll bring that one up and then I'll do a little flick on the end. Again, in the letter V, it's sort of similar to your vowels, so I'd make this one smaller in a word most of the time and bring it just off baseline but hit that waist again. UV, and then W is my favourite letter to bounce. It's just like the letter M where you can really play with the different sizes on your undertones this time though. And you can do it the first one and small, the second one big. You can do the big first one and a small second one, though that does tend to be harder to read. It really depends on the rest of your letters in your word if you're going to use this one. And as I did here, oh, we are doing Miss Q and R. I will go to them in a second. I jumped ahead of myself. You can bring, like I did with the U, this one right up before you do the second one. I'll move on to Q up here. So Q doesn't really bounce that well, but you can do some things with it. So if you've got a Q, you can bring this up before you go down. Gives you some movement at the top. You can bring this line over and up, which gives you a bit more movement here. And it always ends with this one quite high up. So you need to be careful of what letter comes after this. That's the one thing you need to be thinking about when you're bouncing a whole word is what letter comes next. And sometimes that will change how you decide to bounce the words letter that you're currently on. So here, if I ended in R here, that would be absolutely fine. If I was having an R after this one, I'd have to change my exit stroke out the letter so it came higher up here. And then R, there's so many different ways you can letter R, and it's really one you can really play around with. If I just write in the lines again. So a normal R, you would do something like that. You can add a really big loop before you come down over the height. You can make it smaller depending on where you're going. So it's off that baseline. I like to also play around with a sort of normal looking R, where I will do a stem and then come off and bring this up, where I create some movement here as well. You can make this loop sort of wide, big. You can make it a little bit flourishy depending on your overall look. The overall look. WX1. Got Y and Z, I think, left. So with Y, I'm going to be doing something similar with the letter U, where I bring it up and bring it down. So I've got that asymmetry there. You can make the loop really big. You can also bring it so it's a small loop if you've got a lot of descenders in your letters already. And again, you can use that sort of S shape to bring a little bit more movement in rather than just a sort of J-shaped stroke. And then the last letters got X and Z to do. X, it always looks better if your first stroke, which goes that way, is the smaller stroke, and then you can really flourish this second stroke out where you dip under, but you also come above as well. You can also just make it smaller to bounce into your word if it'll look a bit funny if it's big, depending on what other letters you've got around it. If you've got B's and D's, something which has a lot of loops or is just bigger letters, then a smaller X is probably the way to go for that, bringing it off that baseline. And then Z, my favourite Z is where you do it similar to this. And I'll make a really big loop. This will be the baseline. So I've hit it with my first stroke, but I've come back off it as well with the second stroke to dip it underneath. If you don't like that type of Z, you can do a Z that's like this, but change up the angle for the top and the bottom. So you come up a little bit and down, then down again off your baseline here. And before we finish, I just wanted to see if you guys had any words that you wanted me to letter, so you could see in a big word instead of just each individual letter itself. So if you have got any words you want me to show you, then I can. In the workbook that I'm going to link you to afterwards, I have got some words in there as well as the upper and lower case.
Okay, I think with that we have almost covered all the letters here. I see some chat and they're asking for letter R once again, and yeah, and the word kiwi. So I think we'll do that, and then we'll wrap up the session. It's already an hour now, so yeah, let's do that one first.
Okay, so the letter R first is draw them lines. So you've got your baseline and your X height. You can come up to that with the start of your next stroke. You can come above and hit the baseline, or you can do the same, dip below the baseline. The ones with a loop, you bring it up to the baseline, but as you're doing the loop, come over the top and back under, and you can dip it again here. You can make it smaller, so you're coming off your letter and you don't quite hit the baseline here, and then you've got your normal R, which is in the baseline and the X height, but then you come off and come above with this, and this is like a more normal R that you used to write in your normal handwriting. So there are some examples of the different ways you can do R. And then for the letter word kiwi, if I was going to letter it in my style, I would dip the K, make that I quite small, and then my different undertones are different shapes here. I'll write it a bit clearer for you guys. Like that. That's with a bigger pen, so hopefully that's a little bit clearer for you guys. For those who asked about double letters, we have sort of run out of time a little bit here, but in my workbook, I'll let that sort of clear settle in a minute. I have got some words here that will help you with your muscle memory and your technique when it comes to bouncing letters. These are ones where you've got words with a lot of bounce in them, a lot of opportunities to play around with that bounce, and it's got a lot of double letters in it. So I've got words like summer and community, little and stuff. The main thing when you've got two letters together that are the same, so you've got two owls, for example, you're going to want to bounce them a little bit differently. You're going to want to do the same style, but instead, if you're going to do two owls, like I've got, or two T's I've got here in little, you'll see that my second T is a little bit shorter than the first, and they hit at the bottom at different points as well. And this will give you the bounce and stop them sort of merging together. With a letter like M, so I've got here in summer, if you're bouncing one of the overturns and the other one's kind of normal, you don't need to worry so much because you've already got the difference in either the second one to the first one or the first to the second one here. So you're not repeating the same stroke straight after each other. And with an N, you've got the first stem here. So it's a different stroke. So they're not going to merge into a letter M as long as you've got that difference in the between these two strokes. So long as you've got that bounce a little bit and these points hit at different points, then they're not going to merge into the letter M. And also just keep an eye on your spacing so they're not too close together. This will be available so you can practice with this and you can see some examples of my double letters and how I'll bounce them. And if you are stuck on anything, if you're stuck on a particular word or a letter after this session, then feel free to just reach out to me on Instagram and I'll help you as best I can as well.
All right, I think with that we have covered all the beautiful alphabets and a few amazing words like kiwi and all. So thank you so much, Kerry, for the wonderful workshop. It would be great if you can share the link of the PDF, the workbook link with everyone in the chat section, so that people can download it later. Yeah, can you do that now?
Yeah, give me a few seconds.
Till the time Kerry is sharing the workbook with us, I would like to request you guys to click a picture of this session, and if you liked it and if you enjoyed it, which you clearly did, I can see that in the chat. Tag Kerry and tag Print Shop Global on your Instagram stories, and we would love to reshare that. And yeah, I hope all the answers, all the questions have been answered. I see a lot of questions in the chat which have been answered by Kerry. So, so I'm sure that would be helpful too. And yeah, she's sharing the workbook soon.
If I can
And thank you so much, guys, for joining us for this session. I see a lot of repeat attendees. I see few names which which are very common to me now. I see them on almost every session. Okay, so Kerry has shared the workbook.
If you do struggle with it, just hit me up with a DM on Instagram. I'll get it over to you.
All right, all right. So with that, we are here. That brings us to the end of this wonderful session with Kerry Pearson. This was indeed a value-packed session wherein we touched upon a lot of beautiful things and the alphabets that we covered. Thank you so much once again, guys, for joining us for this workshop. But this is not where it ends. We have a lot more events lined up for you guys. The next event is on basic of modern calligraphy. So if you have not registered for that workshop, I'm just dropping the link in the chat section and you can register for that as well. If you want to stay updated with events and workshop like this, you can follow us on our Instagram page, and you can register for the sessions from there. I'm dropping the link of the Instagram page in the chat as well. If you want to watch these session again, or you want to watch the previous workshops that we have had, you can subscribe to our official YouTube channel. So the link will be in the chat section again. All the creative professional and artists who are listening to this and wish to sell their artwork on hundreds of products to the global customer, sign up on print shop. You can visit designhill.com/shop, and you can sign up from there. Apart from that, a last piece of information: we have recently launched a DIY creative tool which is called Designhill Studio. Be it a designer or a non-designer, everyone can create beautiful designs such as collaterals, presentation, social media posts, banners, and much more in just few minutes. So you can check that out by going to designhill.com/studio. On that note, I would like to say goodbye to everyone who joined us here today. Thank you so much, Kerry, once again for joining us and for this wonderful workshop that you have given to the audience. Thank you so much once again for taking out the
You're
time.
welcome.
And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I hope to see you again in the next workshop. Thank you so much and stay safe. Bye bye.
Bye.